There are few stories in the history of video games as dramatic, as heartbreaking, and as ultimately redemptive as the saga of Sega. This is not simply a corporate history. This is a 3-act mythological journey of ambition, hubris, catastrophic failure, and unlikely resurrection. It's a story that resonates because it mirrors the hero's journey itself, a protagonist who rises to challenge the gods, falls from grace through fatal flaws, and finds redemption not through returning to former glory, but through transformation into something new. In the early 1990s, Sega stood at the pinnacle of the gaming world, commanding 60% of the North American console market. They had defeated Nintendo, the seemingly invincible giant. Sonic the Hedgehog had become a cultural phenomenon rivaling Mario himself. Sega wasn't just winning, they were defining what it meant to be cool in gaming. Yet within a decade, Sega would exit the hardware business entirely, their final console, the Dreamcast, becoming one of gaming's most beloved yet commercially tragic systems. This could have been the end of the story. For most companies, it would have been. But Sega's tale has a third act that almost no one predicted. Today, Sega exists as one of the most respected publishers in the gaming industry, with a portfolio spanning critically acclaimed franchises like Persona, Yakuza, and Total War. They've survived not by clinging to past glories, but by accepting transformation. The company that once competed directly with Nintendo and Sony now thrives by doing what it does best: creating exceptional games. The paradox of Sega is this: they are simultaneously a cautionary tale and an inspiration. Their mistakes in the mid-1990s are taught in business schools as examples of how not to manage a brand. Their fragmentation of the market with the Sega CD and 32X, their disastrous Saturn launch, their inability to compete with Sony's PlayStation, these failures nearly destroyed the company. Yet their ability to pivot, to survive, and ultimately to flourish as a third-party publisher demonstrates a resilience rarely seen in the corporate world. Why does this narrative matter? Because Sega's story is ultimately about identity. It's about a company that had to lose everything to discover who they truly were. They thought they were a hardware manufacturer, a console maker destined to compete with Nintendo and Sony forever. But that was never their true calling. Sega was always, at its core, a creator of experiences, an innovator in gameplay and design. The hardware was merely a vehicle. When they lost the vehicle, they discovered they could still drive. This is the entire history of Sega, a history that begins not in Japan, not in gaming, but in the aftermath of World War II, with slot machines and American servicemen stationed in Hawaii. It's a history that spans arcade dominance, console wars, spectacular failures, and quiet triumphs. It's a history that teaches us that sometimes the greatest victory is not in conquering, but in surviving, adapting, and finding a new path forward. The story of Sega is the story of rise, fall, and rebirth, and it begins long before anyone had heard the name Sonic the Hedgehog. The origins of Sega are far removed from the neon-lit arcades and 16-bit console wars that would define its legacy. The story begins in 1940 during World War II, with 3 American businessmen who saw opportunity in entertainment for military personnel. Martin Bromley, Irving Bromberg, and James Humpert founded a company in Honolulu, Hawaii, with a straightforward mission: provide coin-operated amusement machines to American servicemen stationed on military bases. The company was called Service Games, a name that would later be shortened to its now iconic acronym. These weren't sophisticated video games or even electronic devices in the modern sense. They were jukeboxes, slot machines, and mechanical amusement devices designed to provide distraction and entertainment to soldiers far from home. The business model was simple but effective. Install machines on military bases where servicemen had wages to spend and limited entertainment options. After the war ended, Service Games expanded its operations throughout American military bases in Asia, particularly in Japan. The post-war American military presence in Japan created a substantial market for these amusement devices. By the early 1950s, the company had established itself as a reliable provider of entertainment equipment to the occupying forces. But in 1952, everything changed. The United States government, increasingly concerned about gambling and organized crime, outlawed slot machines on military bases. This single legislative act threatened to destroy Service Games' entire business model. Faced with extinction, the company made a fateful decision. If they couldn't sell to American servicemen in Japan, they would sell to the Japanese themselves. The company relocated from Hawaii to Tokyo, transforming from an American business serving Americans abroad into a Japanese operation selling to Japanese consumers. This transition was not instantaneous or simple. Japan in the 1950s was rebuilding from the devastation of World War II. The economy was recovering, but consumer spending on entertainment was limited. Service Games had to adapt its offerings to suit Japanese tastes and economic realities. They shifted focus from slot machines to other forms of coin-operated entertainment, including photo booths and mechanical games that didn't involve gambling. In 1965, Service Games merged with another company, Rosen Enterprises, founded by David Rosen. Rosen had come to Japan in the late 1940s as a serviceman and stayed after the war, building a successful business importing coin-operated games and establishing arcades throughout Japan. The merger combined Service Games' manufacturing capabilities with Rosen Enterprises' distribution network and arcade operations. The merged company formally adopted the name Sega Enterprises Limited, derived from the first two letters of Service and Games. David Rosen became a pivotal figure in Sega's evolution from amusement machine distributor to innovative game creator. Under his leadership, Sega began developing its own electromechanical arcade games, rather than simply importing or distributing others' products. The company's first major success came in 1966 with Periscope, a submarine warfare simulation game that used lights, sound effects, and mechanical elements to create an immersive experience. Periscope was revolutionary for its time. Players looked through a periscope viewer and attempted to target enemy ships using mechanical controls. Lights simulated explosions, and sound effects enhanced the illusion of naval combat. The game was large, impressive, and most importantly, it commanded a higher price point than standard arcade games. While most arcade games cost 10 cents to play, Periscope charged 25 cents. This premium pricing was justified by the elaborate cabinet and engaging gameplay. The game became a massive success in Japan and was exported internationally, marking Sega's first major triumph as a game developer. The success of Periscope established several patterns that would define Sega's approach for decades. First, they were willing to take risks on innovative, technologically ambitious projects. Second, they understood the importance of spectacle and presentation. The experience of playing a Sega game wasn't just about gameplay mechanics, it was about the total sensory package. Third, they recognized that premium experiences could command premium prices. These principles would guide Sega through the arcade golden age and into the console wars. Throughout the 1960s and into the 70s, Sega continued developing electromechanical arcade games. They created driving games, shooting games, and sports simulations, each pushing the boundaries of what was possible with mechanical technology. When electronic components became more affordable and accessible in the mid-70s, Sega was positioned to transition from electromechanical to fully electronic arcade games. Their experience in creating engaging, innovative experiences translated seamlessly to the new medium. By the end of the 1970s, Sega had transformed from a scrappy import business selling slot machines to American servicemen into a respected arcade game manufacturer with international reach. They had survived governmental regulation, economic uncertainty, technological transitions, and intense competition. The foundation had been laid for what would come next. Sega's ascension to arcade dominance and their eventual fateful entry into the home console market. The company that began as service games, providing simple entertainment to soldiers far from home, had discovered its true calling. Sega was in the business of creating experiences, of transporting players to other worlds through technology and imagination. This mission would drive every triumph and every disaster in the decades to come. The late 1970s through the 1980s represented the golden age of arcade gaming, and Sega stood as one of its undisputed kings. While companies like Atari, Namco, and Nintendo competed fiercely for dominance, Sega carved out a reputation for technical innovation, visual spectacle, and gameplay experiences that couldn't be replicated at home. This era established Sega not just as a successful company, but as a creative force that pushed the entire industry forward. Sega's transition to fully electronic arcade games began in earnest in the mid-70s. While their electromechanical games had been successful, the advent of microprocessors and video display technology opened entirely new possibilities. In 1976, Sega released Heavyweight Champ, a boxing game that many historians consider one of the first fighting games. Players controlled a boxer using two joysticks that simulated punching motions. The game was crude by later standards, but it demonstrated Sega's willingness to experiment with novel control schemes and gameplay concepts. The late 70s saw Sega releasing a steady stream of arcade titles, but it was the 1980s that truly defined their arcade legacy. In 1982, Sega released Zaxxon, a groundbreaking isometric shooter that used axonometric projection to create a three-dimensional playing field. Players piloted a spacecraft through enemy installations, navigating obstacles in both horizontal and vertical space. The game's visual style was revolutionary, creating a sense of depth and dimension unprecedented in arcade games of that era. Zaxxon became a massive commercial success, demonstrating that players were hungry for visually innovative experiences. The game's success also highlighted Sega's technical prowess. Creating the isometric perspective required sophisticated programming and hardware capabilities. Sega was proving that they could compete not just on gameplay but on technological achievement. The cabinet itself was distinctive, featuring angled display angles and custom artwork that made it instantly recognizable in arcades worldwide. In 1988, Sega released the Mega Drive in Japan, a 16-bit console designed to bring arcade-quality gaming into the home. Sega had already tested the waters with previous systems such as the SG-1000 and the Master System, but neither had seriously dented Nintendo's dominance. The Mega Drive, however, was designed from the ground up as a competitor, showcasing Sega's mastery in arcade technology and their intention to challenge for the home market crown. The Mega Drive, branded as the Genesis in North America, was a technological leap. Its Motorola 68000 processor, video hardware and advanced sound chips allowed for vibrant graphics and smooth arcade ports. The console's design reflected Sega's arcade pedigree. Classic hits like Altered Beast and Golden Axe appeared practically unchanged from their arcade versions, giving Sega a powerful marketing message. The arcade was now at home. Despite its technical edge, the Mega Drive's launch in Japan was not the blockbuster Sega had hoped for. With Nintendo entrenched and few must-have exclusive games, sales were only modest. North America, though, offered a new chance. The Genesis launched in August 1989, competing directly with the aging but immensely popular NES. Initially, the Genesis lagged as well, lacking a breakout title to prove its superiority to everyday gamers. Sega's leadership in America, most notably Tom Kalinske, understood that specifications alone did not win living rooms. Success would demand more than arcade ports. It would take bold marketing, smart pricing, and above all, a mascot capable of countering Nintendo's Mario. Sega focused its North American strategy on finding that identity. That mascot came in the form of Sonic the Hedgehog. Created by a Japanese team led by Yuji Naka and artist Naoto Oshima, Sonic was fast, brash, and cool, a direct counterpart to Mario's wholesome style. When Sonic the Hedgehog hit in 1991 and was bundled with every Genesis system, the platform found its phenomenon. Sonic's gameplay emphasized speed, smooth scrolling, and bold color, all strengths of the Genesis hardware. Sonic was the perfect embodiment of Sega's brand, a little rebellious, self-assured and aspirational. Marketing campaigns took direct aim at Nintendo, most famously with slogans like, "Genesis does what Nintendo don't." The message worked. Sonic's speed and attitude resonated, boosting both hardware and software sales to new heights and making Genesis the cool console for a new generation. By 1992, the Genesis had overtaken the SNES in North America. Estimates suggest Sega held close to 55–65% of the market during their peak years. Sonic the Hedgehog had become a cultural icon, starring in games, cartoons, and a torrent of merchandise. Sega's focus on sports and arcade action, as well as openness to edgy licensed games, further differentiated their library from Nintendo's more family-oriented fare. The Genesis wasn't just a success, it was a phenomenon. Retailers were filled with Sonic paraphernalia. Children wore Sonic t-shirts, watched the cartoon, and waited for every new game and console add-on with anticipation. Sega had toppled an industry giant and captured the imagination of Western audiences. Internally, however, divisions threatened this golden era. Sega of America, flush with success, wanted to maximize Genesis's lifespan, continuing to leverage Sonic and build on its dominance. Sega of Japan, meanwhile, was already planning the next generation of hardware. The seeds of discord between regional priorities, between creative vision and technical ambition, were being sown in the company's boardrooms. Still, in the early 90s, it seemed like Sega could do no wrong. Third-party developers, enticed by Sega's open licensing and surging platform, flocked to the Genesis. Toys, TV shows, and comics built an empire around Sonic and his world. Parents, retailers, and children all recognized the blue blur. Sega's moment at the top, however, was destined to be brief. What no one realized then was that Sega's greatest triumph, uniting audiences with a single device, a single mascot, a clear brand, would soon give way to one of the most confusing and damaging periods in console history. Add-ons, internal conflict, and strategic arrogance would conspire to shatter the market dominance that Sega had painfully earned. At the dawn of the 1990s, Sega had achieved the once unthinkable. It had outplayed Nintendo on its home turf. But the confidence that came with victory would soon become a root of overreach and discord. The collapse of Sega's console dominance began not with a single catastrophic moment, but with a series of misguided choices made from a position of confidence and internal tension. Between 1992 and 1995, Sega would fragment its audience, confuse the market, and ultimately surrender its lead, not just to Nintendo, but to a new challenger, Sony. This period is often cited as a textbook example of how even successful companies can undermine themselves through poor strategy and a lack of unified vision. The first warning sign was the Sega CD, released in North America in late 1992. The Sega CD was designed as an ambitious add-on for the Genesis, granting CD-ROM capabilities, improved sound, and new hardware features. Sega promoted the device as a necessary evolution, promising next-generation gameplay with full-motion video and epic soundtracks. However, the high price point and a weak software lineup, dominated by grainy, shallow FMV games like Night Trap, left many early adopters disappointed. Instead of a revolution, consumers found awkward tech demos and games that felt like they prioritized showcasing the CD's capabilities over delivering fun. Sonic CD was a rare standout, but it was an exception in a glut of disposable titles. Critically, the Sega CD wasn't a new platform. It required a Genesis to work, making it an expensive investment for incremental returns. It sold around 2 million units worldwide, far fewer than the Genesis base, and began to erode the faith of Sega's largest fans. The real disaster came next, the 32X. In late 1994, Sega launched yet another add-on for the Genesis, the 32X, promising a leap to 32-bit gameplay at a lower price than rival systems. The 32X plugged into the Genesis and sported its own unique games. But by this point, Sega was already marketing the Saturn as their true next-gen console. Most people wondered, why invest in the 32X if the Saturn was coming soon? The 32X's game library was tiny and lacked must-have hits. Retailers struggled to explain to customers which games worked with which hardware. Consumers balked at a marketplace that now included Genesis, Sega CD, 32X, and soon Saturn, all different, all with different libraries. Developers were similarly confused, and many skipped the 32X entirely. Sales were predictably dire. The 32X sold barely over 500,000 units before Sega effectively abandoned it. Those who bought in felt betrayed, and Sega's most loyal audience, the ones who lined up for every new launch, suddenly questioned the company's direction and trustworthiness. Retailers and developers now saw Sega as a high-risk partner. Underlying all these decisions was chronic dysfunction between Sega of Japan and Sega of America. American leadership wanted to ride the Genesis's success for as long as possible and focus on their Western audience, while Japanese leadership pushed aggressive hardware innovation and rapid transitions. The two sides clashed on everything from marketing to product strategy, further muddying Sega's message in the market. By late 1995, Sega's market share had cratered. From a peak above 60%, their slice of the pie fell dramatically as consumers returned to Nintendo or waited for Sony's PlayStation, a system seen as more future-proof and easier to understand. Sega had squandered its goodwill through market fragmentation and overconfidence. Sega's fate was clear. Loyalty was spent, developers were wary, and consumers were fatigued. They had lost the most precious thing in the hardware business: trust. As the next generation of consoles approached, Sega would launch the Saturn with the deck stacked firmly against them. The Sega Saturn should have been Sega's redemption, a powerful, next-generation console backed by their arcade expertise and technical ambition. Instead, the Saturn became a masterclass in how poor planning, corporate infighting, and disastrous launch execution can destroy even the most promising product. The Saturn didn't just fail, it shattered Sega's credibility as a hardware manufacturer and set the stage for their eventual exit from the console business. The Saturn was developed primarily in Japan with a complex dual-processor architecture designed to excel at the kind of experiences Sega knew best: arcade ports, particularly fighting games and 2D gameplay. The system featured two Hitachi SH2 processors running in parallel, which theoretically provided immense computing power. In practice, this architecture was notoriously difficult to program, especially for Western developers unfamiliar with the system's intricacies. The Saturn launched in Japan in November 1994 to respectable initial sales. Japanese consumers, more forgiving of Sega's recent missteps and hungry for arcade-perfect ports like Virtua Fighter, embraced the system. The early Japanese market success gave Sega's leadership false confidence that they could replicate this performance in North America, a market with very different expectations and a much longer memory of the 32X debacle. The North American launch at the first Electronic Entertainment Expo in May 1995 is legendary for all the wrong reasons. Sega of America CEO Tom Kalinske took the stage and announced that the Saturn, originally scheduled for September, was available immediately at select retailers for 390 SOS. The surprise launch was intended to catch Sony off guard and generate buzz. Instead, it became one of the most catastrophic decisions in gaming history. The immediate launch backfired spectacularly on multiple fronts. First, only 4 retail chains received Saturn inventory: Babbage's, Software, etc., Electronics Boutique, and Toys R Us. Major retailers like Walmart, Best Buy, and KB Toys were completely excluded. These retailers, furious at being shut out of a major console launch, retaliated by either refusing to stock Sega products or relegating them to minimal shelf space. Sega had alienated crucial retail partners with a single announcement. Second, game developers were blindsided. Studios that had been working toward a September launch suddenly found their titles nowhere near ready. The launch library was painfully sparse: Virtua Fighter, Daytona USA, and a handful of mediocre titles. There were no compelling exclusives to justify the $399 price tag or the early purchase. Consumers had no reason to rush out and buy a Saturn on launch day. Third, and perhaps most devastatingly, Sony was watching. After Sega's announcement concluded, Sony Computer Entertainment America president Steve Race walked onto the E3 stage, said a single word, $299, and walked off. That one-word presentation announced the PlayStation's price, $100 cheaper than Saturn, launching as originally planned in September, with strong developer support and a robust game lineup. It was a mic-drop moment that gaming historians still reference as one of the most effective presentations ever delivered. The $100 price difference was significant, but the messaging difference was even more damaging. Sony positioned the PlayStation as a sophisticated, forward-thinking platform for maturing gamers. Their marketing was sleek, confident, and backed by a corporation with resources that dwarfed Sega's. Meanwhile, Sega's surprise launch reeked of desperation and poor planning. The Saturn's technical architecture compounded its commercial problems. While the dual processors theoretically provided raw power, the system struggled with 3D graphics compared to PlayStation's purpose-built 3D hardware. Sony's console featured dedicated graphics processing designed from the ground up for polygon-based 3D gaming, the direction the entire industry was rapidly moving. The Saturn's architecture felt like a compromise between 2D sprite excellence and 3D capability, excelling at neither in ways that mattered to Western audiences. Western third-party support evaporated almost immediately. Electronic Arts, which had been instrumental to the Genesis's success with franchises like Madden NFL, announced they would skip the Saturn entirely. EA executives cited the difficult development environment, poor sales projections, and fractured relationships with Sega as reasons for abandoning the platform. Without EA's sports titles, cultural phenomena in North America, the Saturn was crippled before it truly began. Sega's internal studios tried valiantly to compensate. Titles like Panzer Dragoon, Nights into Dreams, Virtua Cop, and Sega Rally Championship showcased what the hardware could do in experienced hands. These were exceptional games that demonstrated artistry, innovation, and technical mastery. But they couldn't overcome the fundamental problem. The Saturn's North American library consisted primarily of Japanese imports and Sega's first-party titles, while PlayStation boasted an exploding catalogue of diverse Western-developed games. Sony aggressively courted third-party developers with developer-friendly tools, generous licensing terms, and marketing support. They secured exclusive deals with landmark franchises and cultivated relationships with studios that Sega had burned through their 32X and Sega CD misadventures. By 1996, the gap was insurmountable. Games like Resident Evil, Tomb Raider, and Final Fantasy VII became PlayStation exclusives, system-selling titles that defined a generation. By 1997, the Saturn's fate was sealed. In North America and Europe, the system was effectively dead, relegated to bargain bins and clearance sales. In Japan, the Saturn maintained respectable sales and continued receiving excellent exclusive titles, but the global picture was disastrous. Sega had gone from 65% market share with the Genesis to distant third place behind both PlayStation and Nintendo 64 in just a few years. Financial losses mounted catastrophically. Sega was hemorrhaging money on every front. Hardware sold at a loss. Software development for a tiny installed base generated minimal returns, and marketing budgets tried desperately to revive interest in a platform consumers had rejected. The company's stock price tumbled. Investor confidence evaporated. The dream of console dominance had become a nightmare of red ink and broken promises. Tom Kalinske, frustrated with Japanese leadership's decisions and the impossible situation created by the surprise launch, departed Sega in 1996. His exit removed one of the key architects of Sega's North American success and symbolized the company's drift. Internal conflict between Sega of Japan and Sega of America reached toxic levels, with each side blaming the other for the Saturn's failure while Sony and Nintendo divided the spoils. The Saturn sold approximately 9.26 million units worldwide over its lifetime, a respectable number for most platforms, but a catastrophic failure for Sega. The Genesis had sold over 30 million units. The Saturn represented not just a commercial disappointment, but an existential crisis. Sega's viability as a hardware manufacturer was now in serious question, yet even as the Saturn gasped its last breaths, Sega was already planning one final attempt at console glory. Lessons had been learned, painful, expensive lessons about architecture, developer relations, launch execution, and retail partnerships. The next console would incorporate all these lessons. It would be developer-friendly, technologically advanced, competitively priced, and supported by a library of incredible games. Sega's engineers and designers poured their hearts into this final console, determined to prove that Sega still belonged in the hardware business. What they created was remarkable, a system that would be beloved by everyone who owned one, praised by critics, and remembered fondly decades later. But love and critical acclaim don't always translate to commercial success. The Dreamcast was coming, and it would break hearts. The Dreamcast launched in North America on September 9, 1999, 9999, a date chosen for its memorable symmetry and marketing appeal. It was Sega's final roll of the dice, their last chance to prove they belonged in the console hardware business. The system was everything the Saturn wasn't. Developer-friendly, technologically impressive, competitively priced, and backed by an outstanding launch lineup. It was also Sega's most beautiful failure, a console beloved by everyone who owned one, yet unable to overcome the damage done by years of corporate missteps. The Dreamcast's development began even before the Saturn had officially died. Sega partnered with Microsoft to use a modified version of Windows CE as one of the system's operating systems, making it easier for PC developers to port games. The console featured a Hitachi SH4 processor and NEC's Power VR2 graphics chip, delivering visuals that exceeded anything available on PlayStation and competed favourably with the upcoming PlayStation 2. Most revolutionary was the built-in modem. 56K dial-up internet connectivity was standard, making the Dreamcast the first console designed from the ground up for online gaming. Sega learned from the Saturn's launch disaster. The Dreamcast launched simultaneously across all major retailers at $100 less than the Saturn's disastrous price point. The company invested $100 million in marketing, the largest advertising campaign in Sega's history. Television commercials were edgy, memorable, and targeted at the young adult demographic Sony had captured. The messaging was clear. This was a fresh start, a new beginning for Sega. The launch lineup was exceptional by any standard. Soul Calibur, widely considered one of the greatest fighting games ever made, arrived as a launch title with visuals that exceeded its arcade counterpart. Sonic Adventure, the first true 3D Sonic game, showcased the mascot in a modern context. NFL 2K from Visual Concepts challenged EA's Madden dominance with superior gameplay and visuals. Power Stone, Hydro Thunder, and House of the Dead 2 demonstrated the system's versatility across genres. The initial response was phenomenal. The Dreamcast sold over 500,000 units in its first 2 weeks in North America, breaking records for console launches. By the end of 1999, over 1 million units had been sold. Critics praised the hardware, the games, and Sega's renewed focus. It seemed briefly that Sega might actually pull off the impossible, that the Dreamcast could rescue the company from its Saturn-era disasters and re-establish Sega as a major console player. The Dreamcast game library grew rapidly with titles that remain beloved today. Shenmue, Yu Suzuki's ambitious open-world adventure, pushed the boundaries of what games could be, featuring unprecedented detail, cinematic storytelling, and a living, breathing world. Jet Set Radio introduced cel-shaded graphics to mainstream gaming, pairing innovative visuals with infectious music and rebellious style. Crazy Taxi became an arcade sensation and home console hit. Resident Evil Code. Veronica gave Dreamcast a survival horror exclusive. The online capabilities were genuinely ahead of their time. Phantasy Star Online pioneered console MMO gaming, connecting players worldwide in shared adventures. NFL 2K and NBA 2K featured online multiplayer that worked remarkably well over dial-up connections. Quake 3. Arena brought PC-quality online shooting to consoles. Sega was building the infrastructure for online console gaming years before Xbox Live and PlayStation Network would make it mainstream. The Visual Memory Unit, The VMU was another innovative touch. This memory card doubled as a tiny handheld device with its own screen and controls, allowing players to view stats, play minigames, and transfer data. It was quirky, very Sega, and beloved by fans even if it never reached its full potential. The Dreamcast controller, while oddly designed with its cord emerging from the bottom, featured analog triggers and responsive controls that developers appreciated, but beneath the surface, fatal problems were accumulating. Sega's financial position was catastrophic after the Saturn's failure. The company had lost hundreds of millions of dollars, and investor confidence was nearly gone. Every Dreamcast console sold at a loss, with Sega banking on software sales to eventually turn profitable. This is standard practice in console gaming, but it requires a large installed base and time. Two things Sega didn't have. The PlayStation 2 loomed large. Sony announced their next console would launch in March 2000 in Japan and October 2000 in North America. The PS2 wouldn't just be a gaming console, it would be a DVD player, a multimedia device, and backward compatible with the massive PlayStation library. Sony's marketing budget dwarfed Sega's. Their brand recognition was unmatched. And crucially, consumers trusted Sony in a way they no longer trusted Sega after the 32X and Saturn debacles. Third-party support, while initially promising, began wavering as the PS2's launch approached. Electronic Arts, still bitter from the Saturn era and betting on PlayStation's dominance, refused to develop for Dreamcast. This meant no Madden NFL, no FIFA, no NHL, franchises that drove console sales in North America and Europe. Visual Concepts' NFL 2K was excellent, perhaps even superior, but it couldn't overcome Madden's brand recognition and EA's marketing machine. Major Japanese publishers hedged their bets or abandoned Sega entirely. Square Enix committed Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest to PlayStation 2. Konami's support was minimal. Capcom provided some exclusives but eventually ported most to other platforms. Developers looked at Sega's history, the rapid abandonment of 32X, the Saturn's failure, and calculated that supporting Dreamcast was too risky when PlayStation 2 offered a guaranteed massive installed base. Sega's marketing, while creative, couldn't overcome structural disadvantages. The $100 million budget sounds impressive until compared to Sony's spending. Sega had to convince consumers to trust them again after years of broken promises, while Sony simply had to remind people that PlayStation was synonymous with gaming. The DVD player functionality of PS2 was a killer app in itself. Consumers could justify the purchase to family members as a multimedia device, not just a gaming console. Piracy also damaged the Dreamcast. The system's GD-ROM format was quickly cracked, and by 2000, burned copies of games circulated widely. This undermined software sales, the lifeblood of Sega's business model. While piracy affects all platforms, the Dreamcast's relatively small installed base made each lost sale more impactful. By mid-2000, despite continued critical acclaim and beloved releases, Dreamcast sales were slowing. The PS2 launched in Japan to massive demand despite hardware shortages and a weak launch library. The mere existence of PS2 sucked oxygen from the room. Consumers who might have bought Dreamcasts instead waited for Sony's console. The momentum Sega had built in late 1999 evaporated. Internally, Sega's financial situation was dire. The company was burning through cash reserves. Banks and investors were losing patience. Sega had bet everything on the Dreamcast's success, and while the console was critically praised and beloved by its owners, it wasn't selling in the numbers needed to sustain a company and compete against Sony's juggernaut. On January 31, 2001, Sega made the announcement that shocked the gaming world. They would discontinue the Dreamcast and exit the console hardware business entirely. After decades of creating gaming platforms, after competing with Nintendo and Sony, after the Genesis's triumph and the Saturn's disaster, Sega was done making consoles. They would restructure as a third-party software publisher, developing games of their former competitors' platforms. The announcement was devastating for Dreamcast owners. The system was barely 18 months old. Games like Shenmue 2, Phantasy Star Online and others represented the console's best software, experiences that could have driven sales if given time. But time was the one thing Sega didn't have. Financial realities and the PlayStation 2's dominance had made the decision inevitable. The Dreamcast sold approximately 10.6 million units worldwide over its brief life. Respectable, but nowhere near the numbers needed for viability. In contrast, the PlayStation 2 would go on to sell over 155 million units, becoming the best-selling console of all time. Sega had created a genuinely excellent console with innovative features, strong software, and devoted fans. But excellence isn't always enough in the brutal business of console hardware. The Dreamcast's legacy is bittersweet. It pioneered online console gaming, introduced visual innovations, and delivered some of the most creative, beloved games of its generation. Owners remember it fondly, often placing it among their favourite consoles despite its commercial failure. But it couldn't overcome Sega's damaged reputation, Sony's dominance, or the financial realities of a company that had squandered its advantages. Sega's exit from hardware manufacturing marked the end of an era. The company that had competed with Nintendo in the arcade golden age, that had beaten Nintendo with the Genesis, that had created Sonic the Hedgehog and defined cool in gaming, that company would never make another console. The hardware dreams were over. But the story wasn't over. Sega still existed. They still employed talented developers, owned valuable intellectual properties, and understood game design better than almost anyone. The question was no longer whether Sega could compete with Sony and Nintendo in hardware. The question was whether Sega could survive at all, and if they did, what they would become. The answer would surprise everyone. The transition from hardware manufacturer to third-party publisher should have killed Sega. Companies with such deep identity crises rarely survive, let alone thrive. Sega's entire brand had been built on hardware, on consoles, on arcade cabinets, on the physical platforms that delivered experiences. Becoming a publisher for former competitors seemed like surrender, like the ultimate humiliation. Yet this transformation, painful as it was, would ultimately save the company and allow Sega to rediscover their true strengths. The immediate aftermath of the Dreamcast discontinuation was chaotic. Sega laid off hundreds of employees, closed divisions and restructured operations. The company's stock price had collapsed. Investor confidence was gone. Sega needed a partner, financial stability, and a clear path forward. They found it in an unlikely place. The pachinko and arcade machine manufacturer Sammy Corporation. Sammy had been observing Sega's struggles with interest. While Sega hemorrhaged money on console hardware, they still possessed valuable assets, talented development studios, beloved intellectual properties, arcade operations in Japan, and decades of game development expertise. Sammy CEO Hajime Satomi saw potential where others saw failure. Merger discussions began in 2003 and culminated in October 2004 with the creation of Sega Sammy Holdings, a new entity combining both companies' strengths. The merger provided crucial financial stability. Sammy's profitable pachinko business generated steady revenue that cushioned Sega during the transition period. This allowed Sega to take the time needed to rebuild their publishing strategy without the immediate pressure of quarterly losses threatening bankruptcy. The arrangement wasn't glamorous, but it was survival. Sega's first challenge as a third-party publisher was existential. Could they actually develop quality games for PlayStation 2, Xbox, and GameCube, their former competitors' platforms? The psychological shift was enormous. Sega developers who had spent careers optimizing for their own hardware now had to learn competitors' architectures. Marketing teams that had promoted Sega consoles now promoted Sega games on Sony and Nintendo systems. The early results were mixed. Sonic Adventure 2 Battle arrived on GameCube in 2002, marking the surreal moment when Sonic appeared on a Nintendo console. Sales were solid, proving there was demand for Sega franchises regardless of platform. But many early ports and releases felt rushed, lacking the polish Sega was known for. The company was still finding its footing, still learning how to operate in this new reality. A turning point came with the sports games division. Sega's Visual Concepts studio had created the excellent NFL 2K and NBA 2K series for Dreamcast. On more widely adopted platforms, these franchises found larger audiences. ESPN NFL 2K5, released in 2004 for PlayStation 2 and Xbox at an aggressive $99.99 price point, was critically acclaimed and competed directly with EA's Madden. The game demonstrated that Sega could not only survive as a third-party publisher, but could challenge industry leaders. However, EA responded with an exclusive licensing deal with the NFL that shut Sega and others out of professional football games. This was a devastating blow that eliminated one of Sega's most promising franchises. But the NBA 2K series continued, and it would eventually become one of the most successful sports franchises in gaming, directly competing with and often surpassing EA's NBA Live series. Meanwhile, Sega's Japanese studios were quietly working on projects that would define their new identity. In 2005, Yakuza launched for PlayStation 2 in Japan, developed by Sega's internal team led by Toshihiro Nagoshi. Yakuza was unlike anything in Sega's traditional portfolio, a mature, story-driven action-adventure set in modern Tokyo's criminal underworld. The game combined brawling combat, detailed world-building, side activities, and emotional storytelling in ways Western audiences hadn't seen from Japanese developers. Yakuza's initial Western release was modest, but in Japan it became a phenomenon. The franchise would spawn numerous sequels, spin-offs, and remakes, eventually building a devoted global fan base. Yakuza represented Sega's willingness to take creative risks and develop mature, culturally specific content rather than chasing Western trends. This creative confidence would become a hallmark of Sega's rebirth. Sega also found success by reviving and reimagining classic franchises. The Total War series, developed by British studio Creative Assembly, which Sega had acquired in 2005, became a cornerstone of their PC strategy. These historically themed strategy games combine turn-based empire management with real-time tactical battles, creating experiences that appealed to hardcore strategy gamers. Total War, Medieval 2, and Total War Empire were both critical and commercial successes, establishing the franchise as one of PC gaming's premier series. The Creative Assembly acquisition demonstrated Sega's evolving strategy. Rather than only developing internally, they would acquire talented studios and give them resources and creative freedom. This approach allowed Sega to expand their portfolio across genres and platforms without the overhead of building every capability internally. It was smart, pragmatic, and represented lessons learned from decades of experience. Sonic remained complicated. As Sega's mascot and most recognizable character, Sonic was crucial to their brand identity. But translating Sonic's speed-focused gameplay to 3D environments proved consistently difficult. Games like Sonic Heroes, Shadow the Hedgehog, and Sonic the Hedgehog 2006 received mixed to negative reviews. The 2006 game in particular was widely criticized for bugs, poor controls, and bizarre design choices. Sonic's reputation was suffering, and by extension so was Sega's. Yet Sega persisted with Sonic, understanding the character's value even when individual games disappointed. This persistence would eventually pay off, though not during this period. For now, Sonic represented both Sega's legacy and their struggle to adapt beloved properties to new gaming paradigms. By the late 2000s, Sega had stabilized. The merger with Sammy provided financial security. Strategic acquisitions like Creative Assembly expanded their portfolio. Franchises like Yakuza and Total War were generating revenue and critical acclaim. The NBA 2K series competed at the highest level of sports gaming. Sega wasn't dominating the industry, but they had found a sustainable model. The company had also shed the enormous costs associated with hardware development, manufacturing, and distribution. Console makers bear risks that publishers don't: inventory management, retail relationships, technology development, and the constant pressure of platform competition. By focusing solely on software, Sega could invest more in game development and take creative risks without betting the company's existence on each decision. Sega's arcade operations in Japan remained profitable, providing another revenue stream. While arcades had declined dramatically in the West, they remained culturally significant in Japan. Sega's experience and infrastructure meant they could continue serving this market effectively. The arcade roots that had birthed the company decades earlier still provided value. The period from 2001 to 2010 represented Sega's cocoon stage, the transformation from one identity to another. It wasn't glamorous. There were failures, missteps, and growing pains. Longtime fans mourned the loss of Sega hardware, the discontinuation of Dreamcast, the end of an era. But through financial stability, strategic acquisitions, creative risks, and persistence, Sega had survived. More than survived. They had built a foundation for what would come next. The worst was behind them. The lessons had been learned. Sega had discovered that their identity wasn't tied to hardware. It was tied to creating compelling experiences. They didn't need to manufacture consoles to be relevant. They needed to make great games. And in the 2010s, Sega would prove that they could do exactly that, emerging not as a relic of gaming's past, but as one of the industry's most respected and diverse publishers. The 2010s marked Sega's true renaissance, a period where the company transformed from a survivor into a thriving, diversified publisher with a portfolio spanning multiple genres, platforms, and audiences. Strategic acquisitions, the maturation of existing franchises, and calculated creative risks combined to create a Sega that was more financially stable and critically respected than at any point since the Genesis era. This was no longer a company limping along on nostalgia. This was a publisher building for the future. The most transformative acquisition came in 2013 when Sega purchased Index Corporation, the parent company of Atlus, one of Japan's most respected RPG developers. Atlus had built a devoted fan base through franchises like Shin Megami Tensei and Persona, games known for their mature themes, stylish presentation, and deep gameplay systems. The Persona series in particular had evolved from a niche JRPG franchise into a cultural phenomenon, with Persona 4 achieving critical acclaim and strong sales. The Atlus acquisition was finalized in November 2013, with Sega paying approximately $140 million, and critics initially worried that Sega might mismanage Atlus, imposing corporate pressure that could compromise the studio's creative vision. These fears proved unfounded. Sega understood that Atlus's value lay in their unique creative voice and gave the studio significant autonomy. This hands-off approach would pay massive dividends. Persona 5, released in 2016 in Japan and 2017 internationally, became a landmark title that transcended its franchise and genre. The game's stylish UI design, memorable characters, jazz-infused soundtrack, and themes of rebellion against corrupt authority resonated with audiences worldwide. Persona 5 sold over 3 million copies, unprecedented for the series, and received universal critical acclaim. The game appeared on countless year-end best-of lists, and introduced Atlus and Sega to audiences who had never played a JRPG before. The success of Persona 5 extended far beyond initial sales. The game's expanded version, Persona 5 Royal, released in 2019, sold millions more. Spin-offs like Persona 5 Strikers further expanded the audience. The game's aesthetic influence permeated gaming and design culture, with its bold red and black color scheme and dynamic UI becoming instantly recognizable. Sega had acquired not just a franchise but a cultural touchstone that defined a generation of RPG gaming. The Atlus acquisition also brought the Shin Megami Tensei series under Sega's umbrella. While less commercially dominant than Persona, SMT maintained a devoted fan base that valued its darker themes and challenging gameplay. Shin Megami Tensei Fi, released in 2021 for Nintendo Switch, received critical praise and strong sales, proving the franchise's enduring appeal. Sega now possessed two of the most respected JRPG franchises in the industry. Meanwhile, the Yakuza series was achieving its own breakthrough in Western markets. For years, Yakuza had been a Japanese phenomenon that struggled to find audiences abroad. But persistent localization efforts, word-of-mouth recommendations, and the PlayStation 4's larger installed base changed the equation. Yakuza 0, a prequel released in 2015 in Japan and 2017 in the West, became the series' breakthrough moment internationally. Yakuza 0's 1980s setting, compelling dual-protagonist story, and perfect balance of serious crime drama with absurd humor captured Western audiences. The game's localization was excellent, preserving the Japanese voice acting while providing quality subtitles. Sales exceeded expectations, and suddenly the previously niche franchise found a global audience hungry for its unique blend of brawling action, emotional storytelling, and bizarre side content. Sega capitalized on this momentum by remastering and re-releasing earlier Yakuza games for PlayStation 4 and later PC. The Yakuza Kiwami remakes brought the original games to modern audiences with updated graphics and mechanics. Each release built the fanbase further. By 2020, Yakuza, Like a Dragon, which reimagined the series as a turn-based RPG, launched simultaneously worldwide on multiple platforms, reflecting the franchise's transformation from Japanese exclusive to global phenomenon. The Total War franchise continued its dominance of the PC strategy market. Creative Assembly released entries spanning different historical periods and settings. Total War, Shogun 2, 2011. Total War, Rome Tsesu, 2013. Total War, Attila, 2015. And Total War, Warhammer, 2016. The Warhammer trilogy proved especially successful, combining Total War's strategic gameplay with Games Workshop's fantasy universe. The partnership generated enormous revenue and brought new audiences to both franchises. Sega's strategy with Total War demonstrated sophisticated portfolio management. Rather than annual releases, they spaced games strategically and supported them with extensive post-launch DLC. This approach generated consistent revenue while maintaining quality and avoiding franchise fatigue. Total War became one of the most profitable PC franchises in gaming, with dedicated fan bases that invested heavily in expansions and content. Sonic's struggles continued through much of the 2010s. Sonic Forces 2017 and Sonic Boom 2014 to 2015 received poor to mixed reviews, frustrating fans who wanted the Hedgehog to recapture his former glory. But Sega persisted, experimenting with different approaches. Sonic Mania, released in 2017 and developed primarily by talented fans-turned-developers, returned to the series' 2D roots with original level designs and modern polish. The game was a critical and commercial success, proving that Sonic still resonated when handled properly. Sega also invested in smaller experimental titles that showcased creative ambition. Catherine, developed by Atlus and published by Sega, was a puzzle platformer with mature themes and anime aesthetics that found a dedicated audience. Valkyria Chronicles, a strategy RPG with unique watercolor visuals and engaging tactical combat, built a cult following. These games didn't sell tens of millions of copies, but they demonstrated Sega's willingness to support diverse creative projects beyond blockbuster franchises. The company's PC strategy evolved significantly during this period. Sega embraced Steam and digital distribution, porting catalog titles and releasing new games simultaneously across console and PC. This contrasted with many Japanese publishers who treated PC as an afterthought. Sega's early commitment to the platform generated goodwill among PC gamers and additional revenue streams without the retail overhead of physical distribution. Financial stability improved steadily throughout the 2010s. Sega Sammy Holdings reported consistent profits from their gaming division, driven by the combination of established franchises, strategic acquisitions, and diversified portfolio. The pachinko business continued providing baseline revenue, but gaming was increasingly driving growth. Sega had successfully transitioned from hardware manufacturer barely surviving to multi-platform publisher thriving across genres and regions. The company's reputation within the industry transformed as well. Developers respected Sega's treatment of acquired studios. The hands-off approach with Atlus and Creative Assembly demonstrated they understood the value of creative autonomy. This reputation helped attract talent and partnerships. Sega was no longer the company that fragmented markets and abandoned platforms. They were reliable partners building franchises for the long term. By 2020, Sega's portfolio was remarkably diverse. Persona and Shin Megami Tensei dominated JRPGs. Yakuza offered unique action-adventure experiences. Total War ruled PC strategy. Sonic persisted as a recognizable mascot despite inconsistent games, and numerous smaller franchises like Puyo Puyo and Hatsune Miku targeted specific audiences. This diversification insulated Sega from the risk of any single franchise failing. The COVID-19 pandemic initially disrupted operations, but gaming demand surged as people stayed home. Sega's catalogue of deep, content-rich games found expanded audiences. Yakuza, Like a Dragon's launch alongside Xbox Series XS and PlayStation 5 positioned the franchise prominently in the new console generation. Persona 5 Royal and Persona 4 Golden on PC introduced the series to massive new audiences. The renaissance was complete. Sega had evolved from hardware manufacturer to software publisher to diversified entertainment company with multiple successful franchises, respected studios, and financial stability. They had survived the Dreamcast's death, the painful transition of the early 2000s, and emerged stronger, more focused, and more creative than they had been in decades. The company that nearly died in 2001 was now one of gaming's most interesting publishers. Not the biggest, not the flashiest, but one that consistently delivered quality experiences across genres. Sega had discovered their true identity, and it wasn't tied to hardware or any single franchise. It was tied to creativity, to taking risks, to fostering talented developers, and to understanding that survival requires adaptation. As of 2025, Sega stands as one of the most quietly successful publishers in gaming. A company that has not only survived catastrophic failure, but has emerged as a critically respected, financially stable force with a portfolio that rivals any publisher in the industry. The modern Sega is no longer chasing hardware dreams or trying to recapture past glories. They are building franchises, nurturing talent, and proving that resilience and adaptation matter more than dominance. The period from 2022 onward has seen Sega consolidate their Renaissance gains while expanding into new territories. The Persona franchise continues its extraordinary trajectory, with Persona 5's influence extending far beyond gaming. The announcement of Persona 6 is one of the most anticipated reveals in RPG gaming, with fans worldwide eagerly awaiting the next chapter. Meanwhile, Persona 3 Reload, a comprehensive remake of the beloved 2006 entry, launched in 2024 to critical acclaim, introducing a new generation to the game that established many of Persona's core elements. Atlus has expanded beyond Persona with Metaphor, Refantasio, a new IP from the Persona development team that released in 2024. The game represents Sega's confidence in Atlus's creative vision, greenlighting an original fantasy RPG rather than simply milking Persona indefinitely. This approach demonstrates Sega's understanding that long-term franchise health requires balancing sequels with new creative endeavors. Early reception suggests Metaphor could become another pillar in Sega's RPG portfolio. The Yakuza franchise, now rebranded as Like a Dragon in international markets to match its Japanese title, has become Sega's premier action franchise. Like a Dragon: Infinite Wealth, released in 2024, continued the series' success with a globe-trotting adventure that took protagonists from Japan to Hawaii. The franchise has maintained its unique identity, blending serious crime drama, absurd humor, extensive side content, and genuine emotional storytelling in ways no other series attempts. Sega's approach to the Like a Dragon series exemplifies their modern philosophy: consistent quality over rushed annual releases, respect for established fans while welcoming newcomers, and willingness to experiment with mechanics. The shift to turn-based combat in Yakuza, Like a Dragon, was controversial but successful, demonstrating that Sega trusts their creative teams to take calculated risks with beloved properties. Sonic has finally found consistent footing after decades of struggle. Sonic Frontiers, released in 2022, represented a bold reinvention that brought open-world exploration to the franchise. While imperfect, the game received generally positive reviews and sold exceptionally well, surpassing expectations and proving Sonic's commercial viability when handled with care. Sega followed up with Sonic Superstars, a 2D entry that built on Sonic Mania's success, and continued supporting the franchise with consistent releases rather than sporadic experiments. The Sonic the Hedgehog film franchise has also become a surprising success, with 2 films performing well at the box office and a third scheduled for release. The films introduced Sonic to audiences who had never played the games, expanding the character's cultural footprint beyond gaming. This multimedia approach, games, films, merchandise, demonstrates Sega's sophisticated understanding of intellectual property management in the modern entertainment landscape. Total War continues dominating PC strategy gaming. Total War, Warhammer 3, released in 2022, combined with its predecessors to create Immortal Empires, a massive combined campaign featuring content from all three games. The scope is staggering. Hundreds of units, dozens of factions, thousands of hours of potential gameplay. Creative Assembly's support through continuous updates and DLC has maintained engagement and revenue years after initial release. Creative Assembly has also branched into other genres under Sega's ownership. While they're primarily known for Total War, the studio has worked on diverse projects including Alien, Isolation, a survival horror masterpiece that found cult status. Sega's willingness to let Creative Assembly experiment beyond their core franchise demonstrates the trust and creative freedom that has become characteristic of their studio management approach. Sega's back catalogue strategy has been particularly savvy in recent years. They've embraced re-releases, remasters, and collections that make classic games accessible on modern platforms. Sonic Origins, Dreamcast collections, and numerous Mega Drive Genesis compilations have introduced younger audiences to Sega's history while generating revenue from existing assets. This approach respects gaming history while serving contemporary consumers who never experienced these titles originally. The company has also invested in live service and free-to-play markets, though with more restraint than some publishers. Phantasy Star Online 2. New Genesis continues the MMO franchise that began on Dreamcast, finding success in Western markets after years of being Japan exclusive. The approach is methodical, supporting games with consistent updates rather than chasing every trend with half-hearted efforts. Sega's financial position in the mid-2020s is stronger than it has been in decades. Sega Sammy Holdings reports consistent profitability from their gaming division, driven by the combination of blockbuster franchises like Persona and Like a Dragon, steady performers like Total War and Sonic, and a deep catalogue of smaller titles serving niche audiences. The diversification strategy has paid off. No single franchise failure could significantly damage the company. The industry's respect for Sega has grown substantially. When Sega announces games, people pay attention. Persona reveals generate massive social media engagement. New Yakuza entries receive enthusiastic reception from critics and fans. Even Sonic, despite past struggles, now launches to genuine interest rather than ironic mockery. Sega has earned credibility through consistent quality and respect for their audiences. Looking toward the future, Sega appears positioned for continued success. The announced slate includes new entries in major franchises, remakes of beloved classics, and original IPs from talented studios. The company has learned to balance nostalgia with innovation, sequels with new properties, blockbuster budgets with smaller creative experiments. This balanced approach suggests sustainability rather than boom and bust cycles. Sega's relationship with retro gaming and preservation also deserves recognition. Unlike some publishers who treat their catalogues as buried treasures, Sega has generally made classic games accessible through various collections and digital releases. This approach acknowledges that Sega's history is valuable, both financially and culturally, and that new generations should experience the games that built the company's reputation. The modern Sega is not the dominant force they were in the early 90s, and they never will be again. But perhaps that's not the goal anymore. Instead, Sega has become something potentially more sustainable. A publisher with diverse franchises, talented studios, creative freedom, and financial stability. They're not trying to beat Sony or Microsoft or Nintendo. They're trying to make great games and serve their audiences well. In that mission, they're succeeding. The company that nearly died when the Dreamcast failed has completed one of gaming's most remarkable transformations. They've proven that identity isn't fixed, that failure doesn't have to be fatal, and that sometimes losing everything forces you to discover who you really are. Sega discovered they were never really a hardware company. They were always creators of experiences, and in 2025 they're creating some of the best experiences in gaming. Sega's transformation from failed hardware manufacturer to thriving publisher represents more than a corporate restructuring story. It embodies fundamental lessons about identity, adaptation, and the difference between survival and success. Understanding what makes Sega's rebirth unique requires examining not just what they did, but why it worked when similar transformations have destroyed other companies. The first philosophical element is acceptance. Sega didn't spend the 2000s trying to return to hardware manufacturing or pretending they could compete with Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo on those terms. They accepted reality completely and immediately. When they announced the Dreamcast discontinuation in January 2001, they didn't hedge or suggest they might return to hardware someday. They committed fully to the transition, and that commitment allowed them to move forward rather than dwelling on the past. This acceptance extended beyond hardware to identity itself. Sega realized that their core strength was never manufacturing consoles. It was creating compelling game experiences. The hardware had been a vehicle, not the destination. By accepting this truth, Sega freed themselves from the enormous costs and risks of platform competition and could focus entirely on what they did best: game development. This shift in self-conception was psychologically profound and operationally transformative. The second element is humility. Sega's missteps in the mid-90s stemmed partly from arrogance born of success. When they commanded 65% of the console market, they believed consumers would follow them anywhere. To CD add-ons, 32-bit upgrades, fragmented platforms. They were wrong, and the consequences were catastrophic. The humility learned from these failures informed every subsequent decision. Sega stopped assuming they knew better than consumers, developers, or market realities. This humility manifests in Sega's treatment of acquired studios. When they purchased Atlus, they could have imposed corporate mandates, pushed for faster release schedules, or demanded changes to make games more commercially accessible. Instead, they gave Atlus creative autonomy, trusting the developers who had built Persona's reputation to continue guiding the franchise. This hands-off approach stemmed from understanding that they didn't know better than the creators, a lesson learned through painful experience. The third element is diversification. Rather than betting everything on a single franchise or genre, Sega built a portfolio spanning JRPGs, action-adventure, strategy, platformers, sports, and more. This approach insulates them from market shifts or individual franchise failures. If Sonic struggles, Persona can carry weight. If Yakuza has a weak entry, Total War maintains revenue. The diversification is both financial strategy and philosophical stance. Sega is not defined by any single property, but by the totality of their creative output. The fourth element is patience. Sega's resurrection wasn't instantaneous. The period from 2001 to roughly 2010 was marked by struggle, experimentation, and incremental progress. Many companies facing similar challenges would have pursued aggressive short-term strategies, chasing trends, cutting costs drastically, or selling valuable properties for quick cash. Sega took the longer view, investing in franchises like Yakuza that took years to find Western audiences, and supporting studios like Creative Assembly through development cycles that spanned years. This patience extended to franchises as well. Sonic struggled for most of 2 decades after the Dreamcast, with more failures than successes. Many publishers would have shelved the franchise or licensed it out. Sega kept trying, kept experimenting, kept iterating until they found formulas that worked. This persistence demonstrated faith that the core appeal of their properties remained valid even when execution faltered. The fifth element is the fan base that never left. Even at Sega's lowest points, the Saturn's failure, the Dreamcast's discontinuation, the painful transition years, a core group of fans remained loyal. They bought Sega games on competitors' platforms. They advocated for ports and localizations. They kept the community alive through forums, fan sites, and grassroots enthusiasm. This loyalty provided Sega with a foundation to rebuild upon, a guaranteed audience that would give them chances to prove themselves. Sega, to their credit, recognized and respected this loyalty. They localized niche games that might not have been commercially justified by pure numbers alone. They listened to fan feedback about franchises. They supported modding communities and preservation efforts. This relationship between Sega and their core fans created a virtuous cycle. Fans supported Sega through difficult times, and Sega rewarded that support with respect and quality products. What makes Sega's resurrection unique is that it wasn't just financial survival, it was creative rebirth. Many companies survive through consolidation, cost-cutting, and playing it safe. Sega survived by taking creative risks, by supporting weird games like Catherine, by letting Yakuza maintain its Japanese identity rather than westernizing it, by trusting Atlus to make niche JRPGs with 100-hour playtimes. They survived by being more creative, not less. This creative confidence stems from understanding their actual value proposition. Sega's brand isn't about power or market share. It's about innovation, style, and experiences that couldn't come from anyone else. The arcade cabinets that moved and shook, the blue hedgehog that ran faster than seemed possible, the crime dramas set in meticulously recreated Tokyo districts. These are distinctly Sega experiences. By leaning into distinctiveness rather than chasing mainstream appeal, Sega found their sustainable niche. The lesson Sega teaches is that corporate identity is not fixed. Companies often define themselves by what they do. We make consoles, we publish books, we manufacture cars, rather than by the underlying value they create. When circumstances force abandoning the what, companies that understand their why can adapt. Sega thought they were a hardware company, but they were actually an experience company. Understanding that difference saved them. Sega's story also demonstrates that failure, while painful, isn't permanent unless you let it be. The Saturn failed. The Dreamcast failed. The early 2000s were humiliating and financially devastating. But those failures became learning experiences rather than death sentences because Sega refused to let failure define them. They learned, adapted, and moved forward. This resilience, psychological as much as financial, distinguishes companies that survive crisis from those that don't. Finally, Sega's resurrection proves that there are multiple paths to relevance in gaming. You don't have to be the biggest publisher, the most powerful platform holder, or the dominant market leader to matter. You can be the company that makes the best JRPGs, or the deepest strategy games, or the most distinctive action franchises. You can serve devoted audiences exceptionally well rather than serving everyone adequately. Quality and distinctiveness create sustainability in ways that chasing scale alone cannot. The philosophy of Sega's resurrection is ultimately about knowing yourself, accepting reality, serving audiences well, and understanding that survival requires transformation. These lessons apply far beyond gaming, far beyond Sega, but nowhere are they illustrated more clearly than in the story of a company that lost everything and discovered that losing everything can be the beginning of something better. The story of Sega is an ancient story retold in modern corporate form. It is the hero's journey, the phoenix rising from ashes, the cycle of death and rebirth that appears in mythologies across cultures and throughout history. Sega rose, fell, and rose again, not to their former position, but to something different, something arguably better. They returned not as conquerors but as creators, and in that transformation discovered their true purpose. In the early 1990s, Sega commanded 65% of the North American console market. They had defeated Nintendo, the giant that seemed unbeatable. Sonic the Hedgehog was a cultural phenomenon. Sega was cool, rebellious, and dominant. Parents bought Genesis systems for their children. Developers flocked to the platform. The future seemed limitless, and Sega stood at the center of gaming's universe. Then came the fall, rapid, devastating, and almost entirely self-inflicted. The Sega CD fragmented the market. The 32X betrayed consumer trust. The Saturn launched disastrously and failed commercially. The Dreamcast, despite being beloved, couldn't overcome the damage done by years of missteps. By 2001, Sega had exited hardware manufacturing entirely, their consoles joining the graveyard of failed platforms that litter gaming history. This could have been the end. It should have been the end. Most companies don't survive such catastrophic failure, but Sega endured, rebuilt, and slowly, painfully, found a new identity. They discovered they didn't need to manufacture consoles to matter. They needed to make great games, and they could do that for anyone's platform. The resurrection came through acceptance, humility, creativity, and patience. Sega acquired talented studios and gave them freedom. They nurtured franchises like Yakuza and Persona that took years to find audiences. They kept experimenting with Sonic until they found formulas that worked. They diversified across genres and platforms, building a portfolio that could weather any single franchise's struggles. And slowly the industry's respect returned. Today's Sega would be unrecognizable to someone from 1993. They don't make consoles, they develop games for Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft, their former competitors. Sonic appears on platforms that once would have been unthinkable. But if that time traveler looked beyond the surface, they'd recognize something essential. Sega is still creating distinctive experiences, still taking creative risks, still pursuing innovation over playing it safe. Sega's legacy extends beyond their own corporate survival. They pioneered online console gaming with the Dreamcast built-in modem. They proved that arcade-quality graphics could exist in home consoles. They demonstrated that mascot characters could compete with Nintendo's established icons. They showed that mature, Japanese-focused games like Yakuza could find global audiences. Every successful publisher today builds on foundations Sega helped establish. The story resonates because it's fundamentally human. We all face moments where our identity is challenged, where what we thought defined us is stripped away. Companies, like people, can respond to such moments with denial, bitterness, and stagnation, or with acceptance, adaptation, and growth. Sega chose growth, and in doing so became something more resilient than they were at their peak. Why does this story matter in 2025? Because the gaming industry continues evolving at breakneck pace. Cloud gaming, subscription services, generative AI, and new platforms constantly threaten to disrupt established business models. Companies that cannot adapt will fail. Sega's story teaches that adaptation is possible, that failure isn't final, and that sometimes losing everything forces you to discover strengths you didn't know you had. The eternal return, the concept that events recur in cycles, applies to Sega not as literal repetition, but as thematic resonance. They rose through innovation and risk-taking in arcades. They fell through hubris and fragmentation. They rose again through humility and creative focus. Each cycle taught lessons that inform the next. The Sega that dominates today's JRPG landscape through Persona exists because the Sega that failed with Saturn learned painful lessons about developer relations and creative freedom. Sega's influence permeates modern gaming in ways not always obvious. The stylish UI design of Persona 5 influences games across genres. The narrative ambition of Yakuza pushes other developers to take storytelling more seriously. The strategic depth of Total War sets standards for the entire strategy genre. Sonic, despite his struggles, remains one of gaming's most recognizable characters. Sega shapes gaming through creativity and quality, rather than market dominance. The sleeping giant metaphor that often describes Sega is imperfect. Giants imply power through size and force. Sega is not a giant. They're something more interesting. They're survivors, innovators, and creators who learn that influence doesn't require dominance. They matter because they make games that no one else does, that serve audiences others ignore, and that push creative boundaries others avoid. Looking forward, Sega's future seems brighter than at any point since the Genesis era. They have financial stability, critically acclaimed franchises, talented studios, and industry respect. They're not trying to conquer gaming, they're trying to enrich it. And in that mission, they're succeeding in ways that pure market dominance never could. The entire history of Sega, from slot machines on military bases to Persona 5's cultural phenomenon, teaches us that identity is fluid, failure is temporary, and creativity endures. It teaches us that sometimes the greatest success comes not from achieving your original goal, but from discovering that your original goal wasn't actually what mattered. Sega thought they were a hardware company destined to compete with Nintendo and Sony forever. They were wrong. They were always a company that created experiences, that transported players to other worlds, that took creative risks and pushed technological boundaries. The hardware was just the vehicle. When they lost the vehicle, they didn't stop driving. They just found new roads. This is the story of Sega, a story of rise, fall, and rebirth, a story of hubris and humility, a story of failure transformed into wisdom, a story that began with servicemen in Hawaii playing slot machines and continues today with millions of players worldwide experiencing some of the best games in the industry. It's a story that isn't. It's still being written with every new release, every creative risk, every franchise that finds its audience. He Sleeping Giant didn't just wake up. It transformed into something better than it was before. And that transformation, that phoenix flight from ashes to sky, is why Sega's story will endure as long as people care about gaming, about creativity, about resilience, and about the eternal possibility of rebirth.